Happy Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law said with a bright smile as she slipped a folded card into my hand. Everyone around the table laughed before I even opened it. Inside were just 6 words, 3 days away. One housekeeper, you. I looked up slowly, expecting someone to tell me it was a harmless joke, but instead I found lowered eyes, amused smiles, and my own son quietly sipping his wine as if nothing unusual had happened. I smiled back because, at that moment, they believed they had decided exactly who I was. What they didn't know was that the house they planned to enjoy for the next 3 days was legally mine, and before the holiday ended, every one of them would discover that respect can never be demanded from someone you have spent years taking for granted. I'm Eleanor Brooks, 68 years old, a retired elementary school librarian, a widow of 6 years, and a mother who spent most of her life believing that if you loved your family enough, they would eventually love you the same way. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday because it wasn't about expensive gifts or fancy decorations. It was about gathering around one table, sharing familiar recipes, telling old stories, and remembering that family was supposed to be the safest place in the world. At least, that was what my late husband, Thomas, always believed. Every November, he would wake before sunrise to season the turkey while humming old country songs that he never quite remembered correctly. He used to tell me that the smell of roasted turkey and fresh rolls was better than any perfume because it meant home. Even after he passed away from heart failure, I kept every tradition alive, partly for our son Daniel, partly for our granddaughter Lily, and partly because traditions sometimes become the only bridge connecting yesterday with today. This year, Daniel insisted that Thanksgiving should be held at the lake house. "Mom, it'll be easier for everyone," he said over the phone a month earlier. "Brittany has everything planned." I agreed without hesitation. I even baked the pecan pies Brittany claimed everyone loved, although I knew Daniel had always preferred pumpkin. The evening air was crisp as I drove the 90 miles to the lake, watching rows of orange and golden trees blur past my windshield. The house looked beautiful when I arrived. Warm lights glowed through every window, and laughter drifted across the front porch. For a brief moment, I believed this holiday might finally feel like the old days again. Brittany greeted me with a cheerful hug that barely touched my shoulders. "Happy Thanksgiving, Eleanor," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." She never called me Mom. Not once in the 12 years she had been married to my son. I carried inside 2 homemade pies and a casserole dish that was still warm beneath the towel wrapped around it. Nobody offered to help. Daniel was busy watching football with his cousins. Lily was showing everyone pictures from school on her tablet. Brittany directed people like the hostess of a restaurant, assigning seats and reminding everyone to keep drinks off the new rug. I quietly placed my dishes in the kitchen and straightened the serving spoons that someone had tossed carelessly beside the stove. Old habits stay with you. Before dinner, everyone gathered around the long oak table overlooking the lake. Candles flickered softly between bowls of mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, stuffing, and roasted vegetables. The scene looked perfect enough to belong on the front of a holiday magazine. Then Brittany stood, tapped her glass with a spoon, and smiled at me. "Before we eat," she announced, "I have a little Thanksgiving surprise for Eleanor." The room fell silent. She reached into her sweater pocket, pulled out a cream-colored envelope tied with a tiny gold ribbon, and placed it gently into my hands as though she were presenting the most thoughtful gift in the world. My fingers rested on the ribbon for a second longer than anyone probably noticed. I could feel every pair of eyes waiting for my reaction, as though the real entertainment had not been the turkey or the football game, but whatever was inside that little envelope. I untied the ribbon carefully and slid out the card. The heavy cream paper looked expensive, decorated with tiny gold leaves around the edges. Across the front, in elegant lettering, were the words that had already been read aloud in my mind before I even finished looking at them. Beneath them was a neatly typed schedule listing breakfast cleanup, lunch preparation, dinner service, laundry, guest room cleaning, fresh towels every morning, grocery runs, and evening kitchen duty. At the bottom, Brittany had added a handwritten note with a smiling face. "We thought this would be the perfect way for you to stay busy while the rest of us relax." Laughter circled the table again. One of Daniel's cousins chuckled and said, "That sounds fair. Eleanor always keeps everything running better than anyone." Another relative added, "She actually enjoys taking care of people." I looked toward my son. If there had ever been a moment for him to say, "Mom has done enough," This was it. Instead, Daniel smiled awkwardly and shrugged. Mom has always been the organized one, he said quietly. She probably does not mind. Those words landed far heavier than the card itself. It was not cruelty that hurt the most. It was indifference. I folded the card neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. Thank you, I said with a gentle smile. I appreciate knowing exactly what everyone expects. Brittany beamed as though she had just received my approval. See, she said, looking around the table. I told everyone you would understand. Dinner continued almost immediately. Plates were passed from one end of the table to the other. Someone complimented the stuffing. Another person debated which football team would make the playoffs. My pecan pies disappeared slice by slice, and no one seemed to remember that I had spent nearly 2 full days preparing them. I served gravy, refilled water glasses, and quietly stood whenever someone asked for another basket of rolls. The rhythm felt painfully familiar because this was not the first holiday when I had become invisible. I remembered Christmas 3 years earlier when Brittany handed me an apron before anyone else arrived because she said it matched the kitchen decorations. By the end of that evening, every other adult had relaxed in front of the fireplace while I washed dishes alone. Then there had been Lily's 8th birthday party. I spent hours decorating cookies with my granddaughter only to discover that every family photograph had been taken while I was cleaning frosting from the counters. Looking back, I realized those moments had never been accidents. They had simply been smaller versions of what was happening now. Over the years, everyone had quietly accepted the idea that I would always step forward, always say yes, always put my own comfort somewhere near the bottom of the list. The expectation had grown so gradually that nobody questioned it anymore, not even me. Brittany lifted her wine glass and announced that tomorrow morning everyone planned to sleep late before spending the afternoon shopping in town. The following day, they wanted to rent a pontoon boat, and on the third day, they had reservations for a lakeside restaurant nearly 30 miles away. Everything is covered, she said proudly, as long as the house stays clean while we are gone. She glanced at me with another polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. I left a checklist on the refrigerator in case you forget anything. I nodded once and took another bite of turkey, although I could barely taste it. Outside the tall dining room windows, the lake reflected the last colors of the November sunset, calm and still beneath the cool evening sky. Thomas used to say that quiet water often hid the deepest currents. Sitting there with the envelope resting beside my plate, I found myself thinking about those words more than I had in years, because for the first time since losing him, I no longer felt hurt alone. Beneath the disappointment, something steady and unmistakable had begun to settle into place, and it was far stronger than anger. The meal ended the way family dinners often do, with chairs sliding back, conversations breaking into smaller groups, and someone suggesting coffee by the fireplace. Before I could stand, Brittany clapped her hands lightly. Before everyone disappears, she said cheerfully, let us make sure Eleanor has everything she needs. She walked into the kitchen and returned carrying a small white basket filled with rubber gloves, cleaning supplies, fresh sponges, and a folded notebook. She placed it in front of me as though she were presenting a thoughtful holiday gift. This is your housekeeping kit, she said with a smile. I labeled everything so it will be easy. Several people laughed politely. Daniel glanced toward me for only a moment before looking back at the football game playing silently on the television mounted above the fireplace. Nobody appeared uncomfortable enough to stop what was happening. Brittany opened the notebook and began reading from the first page. Tomorrow morning, breakfast dishes should be finished before 10. We will probably be back around 4 in the afternoon, so fresh coffee would be wonderful. Friday, we are renting the pontoon boat, so please remember to wash all the beach towels before we return. Saturday, we have dinner reservations, so you can enjoy a quiet evening while making sure the guest rooms are ready for checkout on Sunday. She spoke with the confidence of someone assigning tasks to an employee who had already accepted the position. I simply nodded and took the notebook into my hands. Is there anything else? I asked calmly. Brittany laughed. I knew you would make this easy. Those words stayed with me long after everyone scattered through the house. Lily hugged me before running upstairs with her cousins. Good night, Grandma, she whispered. Your pie was the best. Her quiet kindness was the only genuine thing I had heard all evening. I carried the serving bowls into the kitchen without being asked because leaving them overnight had never felt right to me. As warm water filled the sink, I watched reflections from the kitchen lights shimmer across the window overlooking the lake. The silence gave my thoughts room to settle. This house had witnessed so many Thanksgivings with Thomas. He used to insist that nobody touched a single dish until every guest had spent at least an hour talking together. "The plates can wait," he always said. "People cannot." Tonight the plates had become my responsibility before the conversation had even ended. While I rinsed the china, voices drifted in from the living room. Brittany was describing tomorrow's shopping trip. Someone joked that it would be nice not to worry about cooking or cleaning for 3 whole days. Another voice answered, "That is why Eleanor is here." The sentence was spoken so casually that it almost sounded reasonable. That was the frightening part. Nobody believed they were being disrespectful because they had slowly become accustomed to expecting everything from me. Years of saying yes had quietly taught them that my time belonged to everyone else. I dried my hands with a linen towel and looked around the kitchen. Every counter was spotless. The dishwasher hummed softly. The leftovers were labeled and stacked neatly inside the refrigerator. I had finished almost everything before anyone else noticed. For a moment, I wondered how different my life might have been if I had occasionally allowed someone else to carry part of the weight. As I reached for my purse, I felt the envelope still tucked inside. I opened it again and studied the elegant handwriting across the front. The paper itself was expensive, but the message revealed something far more valuable than Brittany had intended. It showed me exactly how she saw me. Not as Daniel's mother. Not as Lily's grandmother. Not as the woman who had welcomed her into our family 12 years earlier. She saw me as free labor wrapped in polite manners. I slipped the card back into its envelope and quietly walked upstairs to the guest bedroom overlooking the lake. The room was comfortable, with fresh quilts folded neatly across the bed and framed photographs of family vacations hanging on the walls. I noticed something that had escaped my attention before. Nearly every recent photograph included Brittany, Daniel, and Lily. In several of them, I was missing entirely, even though I remembered standing only a few feet away when the pictures had been taken. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out across the dark water. Somewhere beyond the trees a loon called into the cold November night. Thomas had loved that sound because he said it reminded him that quiet places often revealed the truth more clearly than crowded rooms ever could. As I rested my hands in my lap, my telephone vibrated softly on the nightstand. The screen displayed a name I had not expected to see, and the message waiting beneath it made me realize that this Thanksgiving weekend was about to change in a way none of us could have imagined. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. The message had come from Martin Hayes, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate for more than 20 years. We had exchanged Christmas cards and occasional birthday greetings after my husband passed away, but he almost never contacted me without a reason. His message was short. "Mrs. Brooks, I apologize for reaching out during the holiday. I have been trying to speak with you for several days. Please call me before anyone makes decisions regarding the lake house." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. My heartbeat remained steady, but my thoughts began moving much faster. Decisions regarding the lake house. The wording felt unusually careful. Thomas had always admired Martin because he never wasted words. If he believed something required immediate attention, there was usually a very good reason. I glanced toward the bedroom door and listened. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere downstairs I could hear faint laughter followed by the sound of a football announcer celebrating another touchdown. Nobody upstairs knew that my evening had quietly shifted in a completely different direction. I slipped on a sweater, stepped onto the small balcony outside the guest room, and dialed Martin's number. He answered before the second ring. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "I am relieved you finally picked up." I apologized for missing his earlier calls, explaining that I had driven to the lake for Thanksgiving. "I expected as much," he replied. "That is exactly why I needed to reach you." The cold November air brushed across my face while I listened. Martin spoke calmly, choosing each sentence with the same precision Thomas had always appreciated. Several months earlier, he explained, the family trust established by my husband had reached an important review date. Most of the documents had already been updated, but one signature from me was still required before certain records could be finalized. "Nothing urgent until recently," he said. Then I received an inquiry about temporary occupancy rights connected to the property. I frowned. "Occupancy rights?" "Yes," he answered. "Someone contacted my office asking whether the lake house could eventually be transferred outside the trust after your lifetime. I declined to discuss any private matters, of course, but the inquiry concerned me. I rested one hand against the wooden railing. Did they identify themselves? Martin paused for a brief moment. The caller did not introduce herself immediately. However, before ending the conversation, she mentioned that she was your daughter-in-law. I closed my eyes for only a second. The pieces that had felt scattered all evening suddenly shifted a little closer together. Brittany had never asked me direct questions about Thomas's estate, but over the past few years, she had developed an unusual interest in the lake house. She often commented that it would be the perfect place for family vacations or future retirement. I had always assumed she simply liked the view. Now I wondered if those conversations had carried a different purpose all along. Martin, I asked quietly, I have always believed the property belonged equally to Daniel and me after Thomas passed away. That is a common misunderstanding, he replied. Thomas wanted you to enjoy complete security for the rest of your life. The trust gives you exclusive authority over how the property is used while you are living. No one may claim permanent rights or make ownership decisions without your written approval. I looked across the moonlit lake where the dark water reflected tiny silver streaks beneath the stars. Thomas and I had spent countless evenings sitting on that same shoreline sharing coffee after long work weeks. He had once told me that a home should never become a reward for good behavior or a weapon during family disagreements. It should remain a place of peace. The memory settled gently in my heart. There is one more thing, Martin continued. I think you should visit my office after the holiday. There are documents your husband specifically asked me to review with you in person if circumstances ever suggested your kindness was being mistaken for obligation. I thanked him quietly and promised I would come first thing Monday morning. After ending the call, I remained on the balcony for several more minutes. The cold air no longer bothered me. Downstairs I could still hear laughter floating through the warm house, but it sounded strangely distant now. Earlier that evening, I had believed I was simply enduring another family gathering where my efforts would go unnoticed. Now I understood that something much larger had been unfolding beneath the surface for years. I folded my telephone into my pocket, looked once more across the peaceful lake, and realized that before this holiday weekend ended, I would finally stop carrying responsibilities that had never truly belonged to me. The next morning I woke before anyone else, just as I always had on Thanksgiving weekends. Years of habit do not disappear simply because your heart has changed overnight. Pale morning light spilled across the lake, turning the water into a sheet of silver that looked almost untouched by the world. For a few peaceful minutes, I sat beside the bedroom window with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet house before another day of expectations began. I found myself remembering mornings with Thomas. He always believed the first hour of the day belonged to gratitude rather than obligation. We would sit together on the back porch wrapped in heavy blankets, watching the mist drift across the water while making plans that almost never involved money. He used to say that the greatest luxury in life was waking up where you were respected. At the time, I thought he meant the beauty of the lake. Now I realized he had been talking about something much deeper. By 7 o'clock, I was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Pancakes browned on the griddle while bacon cooked slowly in the oven. Fresh fruit filled 2 serving bowls, and the coffee pot had already brewed its second batch. One by one, the rest of the family wandered downstairs wearing comfortable vacation clothes instead of the outfits from the night before. Brittany stretched her arms and smiled when she saw the table already prepared. I knew I could count on you, she said as she poured herself coffee without asking whether I had eaten. Daniel glanced around the kitchen and nodded with quiet approval. Everything smells great, Mom. It was the same compliment he had given me since he was 10 years old, yet somehow it no longer felt like appreciation. It sounded more like confirmation that his expectations had once again been met. During breakfast, everyone discussed the shopping trip they had planned for the afternoon. Brittany unfolded a tourist brochure and circled several boutiques she wanted to visit. One cousin suggested stopping at a winery before dinner. Another wanted to explore an antique market nearly 20 miles away. They planned an entire day of laughter and sightseeing while speaking as though the meals would somehow appear by themselves and the house would naturally remain spotless. Before anyone stood from the table, Brittany slid a yellow notepad toward me. I almost forgot, she said brightly. I made today's checklist even simpler. I looked down. Vacuum the living room. Wash all bedding. Restock the bathrooms. Sweep the porch. Prepare dinner for 8 people by 6 o'clock. Pick up groceries if anything runs low. At the bottom, she had written another cheerful reminder. Please keep your telephone nearby in case we need anything. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it beside the envelope from the previous evening. Of course, I answered. My calm response seemed to satisfy everyone. They mistook silence for agreement because that was what they had grown accustomed to seeing. Less than an hour later, the house emptied. Doors closed, engines started, and cheerful voices faded down the winding road toward town. I stood alone on the front porch watching the last sport utility vehicle disappear beyond the trees. The sudden quiet felt different this time. It was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence that comes just before an important decision. I walked back inside, locked the front door, and placed the yellow checklist on the kitchen counter. Then I reached into my purse and removed Martin's business card. Instead of picking up a mop or gathering laundry baskets, I dialed his office. He answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. "I had a feeling you might call." I smiled softly for the first time all weekend. "Martin," I replied, looking around the peaceful kitchen that Thomas had loved so much. "I think it is finally time for me to understand everything my husband tried so carefully to protect." Martin asked me whether I could drive into town that afternoon. I looked through the kitchen window toward the empty driveway and smiled faintly. "Everyone will be gone for hours," I said. "Nobody will even notice." He suggested meeting at his office just after 1 o'clock, and by noon I had already finished straightening the breakfast dishes. Not because anyone had ordered me to, but because I refused to leave a home untidy simply to make a point. There is a difference between serving with love and serving because someone believes you have no choice. I picked up my coat, locked the front door behind me, and drove the familiar winding road into town. The trees lining the highway had almost finished shedding their autumn leaves, covering the shoulders with shades of gold and amber. Thomas always loved this drive. He said every season reminded people that change was not something to fear. Sometimes it was the only way new life could begin. Martin's office occupied the second floor of a quiet brick building overlooking the courthouse square. He greeted me personally at the door, offering the same warm handshake he had given Thomas for decades. His expression was kind, but there was also concern in his eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "There are a few things your husband wanted you to understand if this day ever arrived." We sat across from one another in a conference room where thick folders rested neatly on the polished table. Martin opened the first binder and carefully slid several documents toward me. "When Thomas created the Brooks Family Trust," he explained, "he was very clear about one priority. He wanted you to live with dignity for the rest of your life." He pointed to several highlighted paragraphs while patiently explaining each provision in plain language. The lake house, every improvement made to the property, and every decision regarding its use remained entirely under my authority during my lifetime. No family member could assume control, promise it to someone else, rent it, or establish permanent occupancy without my written approval. Even temporary use could be revoked if I believed the property or the spirit of the trust was being abused. I sat quietly absorbing every word. "Thomas never mentioned all of this," I whispered. Martin smiled gently. He hoped he would never need to. He trusted your generosity, but he also understood that generous people are sometimes surrounded by those who mistake kindness for surrender. He reached into another folder and removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a short letter dated just 6 months before his passing. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I was right about one thing. You would spend more time protecting everyone else's happiness than your own. Please remember that love and respect must always walk together. The day someone expects your sacrifice instead of appreciating it is the day you must finally protect yourself. This house was never meant to become a prize for anyone. It was built so you would always have a place where you were treated with dignity." I read the letter twice before carefully folding it again. Tears gathered in my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the quiet release that comes when someone who truly knew you had already prepared a path long before you realized you would need it. Martin waited patiently before speaking again. "There is one final matter," he said. "If you wish, we can immediately update the occupancy authorization. Beginning today, every future reservation, guest access request, and property management instruction will require your direct approval. Until now, the caretaker has accepted requests through a standing family authorization established years ago. That can be changed with one signature. I looked down at the pen resting beside the documents. For years, I believed saying yes kept families together. Sitting there in that quiet office, holding Thomas's final letter in my hands, I finally understood that sometimes the healthiest word a family can hear is no. I picked up the pen without hesitation, signed exactly where Martin indicated, and as the ink dried across the page, I felt something inside me become lighter than it had been in many years. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed 2 o'clock, and somewhere back at the lake house, everyone still believed I was waiting patiently to finish another list of chores. Eleanor drove back to the lake house just before the afternoon sunlight began to soften across the water. The familiar road no longer felt heavy beneath her tires. Thomas's letter rested safely inside her handbag, and every sentence seemed to steady her breathing. For years, she had carried responsibilities that no one had questioned because she had never questioned them herself. Today, for the first time, she understood that kindness did not require surrender. The driveway was still empty. Everyone remained in town enjoying the holiday they had planned without giving a second thought to the person they expected to keep everything running behind the scenes. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the fireplace. Instead of reaching for a vacuum cleaner or gathering laundry baskets, she walked slowly from room to room, noticing details she had overlooked before. Shoes were scattered near the entrance. Damp towels had been left on bedroom floors. Empty coffee mugs rested on windowsills overlooking the lake. None of it made her angry. It simply reminded her how easily people stop noticing the work done by someone they assume will always be there. Eleanor brewed herself a fresh cup of coffee and carried it onto the back porch. The November breeze was cool enough to require a sweater, but the view remained as beautiful as it had been the first summer Thomas brought her there more than 30 years earlier. They had built memories in that house one careful season at a time. They painted walls together, planted maple trees along the driveway, replaced old docks after spring storms, and celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet evenings without needing expensive vacations or elaborate plans. The lake house had never been about luxury. It had always been about belonging. She smiled gently as she remembered Thomas laughing while teaching Daniel to fish from the old wooden dock. Their son had been only 8 years old then, impatient and full of questions. Thomas always answered with patience. A family is measured by how people treat each other when nobody is keeping score, he used to say. Eleanor wondered when Daniel had stopped remembering those lessons. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a pickup truck pulling into the driveway. A middle-aged man wearing a dark green work jacket stepped out carrying a clipboard. Eleanor recognized him immediately. It was Richard Collins, the longtime property manager who had overseen seasonal maintenance at the lake house for years. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with a friendly smile. "I was told you wanted to meet today." She invited him onto the porch and offered him a cup of coffee. Richard thanked her before opening his folder. "I received updated paperwork from Mr. Hayes this afternoon," he explained. "Nothing dramatic. Just revised authorization instructions. From now on, every reservation, maintenance request, guest approval, and property access instruction comes directly through you." Eleanor nodded quietly. "That is exactly how Thomas intended it." Richard smiled. "That is what Mr. Hayes told me too. He always said your husband planned everything carefully." They reviewed several routine documents together. Eleanor approved upcoming maintenance for the dock before winter and scheduled a roof inspection for early spring. The conversation was calm, practical, and surprisingly reassuring. For the first time in years, she felt like the caretaker of her own future rather than someone borrowing a place in someone else's life. Before leaving, Richard paused beside his truck. "Mrs. Brooks," he said kindly, "I have watched families come and go around this lake for more than 25 years. The happiest ones are never the wealthiest. They are the ones where people remember to thank each other." Eleanor watched him drive away before returning her attention to the quiet house. The afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floors, and she suddenly realized there was nothing urgent demanding her attention. She chose not to follow Brittany's checklist. Instead, she opened one of Thomas's favorite books from the shelf beside the fireplace and spent the next hour reading while the fire crackled softly nearby. It was the most peaceful holiday afternoon she had enjoyed in a very long time. She knew difficult conversations still waited ahead, but they would happen on her terms, not because someone else expected her silence. Outside, another car engine echoed faintly in the distance as the family began making their way back from town, completely unaware that while they had been shopping for souvenirs and enjoying the holiday, the balance of authority they had quietly taken for granted had already changed. The sound of car doors closing echoed across the driveway, just as the late afternoon sun settled behind the tall maple trees. Laughter drifted toward the house before anyone reached the front steps. Shopping bags swung from their arms, and Lily excitedly carried a small snow globe she had chosen from one of the gift shops in town. I closed the book resting in my lap and stood to greet them with the same calm smile I had worn throughout the holiday. Brittany walked through the front door first, balancing several department store bags on one arm. "Perfect," she said as she looked around the spotless living room. "I knew everything would be exactly the way we left it." She set her purchases on the sofa without noticing that nothing else had changed. The fresh flowers remained in the same vase. The fireplace still burned softly. The kitchen counters were clean, but not because I had spent the entire afternoon following her checklist. I had simply taken care of the ordinary things that made a home feel welcoming. Daniel carried in 2 larger boxes and smiled. "Looks like you had a relaxing day too, Mom." I nodded. I did. It was the simplest, truthful answer I had given in a very long time. Brittany wandered into the kitchen and immediately reached for the yellow notepad she had left on the counter that morning. She glanced down, expecting to see every task checked neatly in blue ink. Instead, the paper rested exactly where she had left it, untouched. Her smile faded for the first time all weekend. "You forgot the list," she said. Her voice remained pleasant, but I recognized the strain beneath it. "No," I answered quietly. "I chose not to use it." The room grew noticeably still. Daniel looked up from unpacking groceries. One of the cousins paused halfway through opening a bag of snacks. Brittany laughed softly, as though she expected me to explain the misunderstanding. "Well," she replied, "there are still a few things that need to be done before dinner." I folded my hands together. "Then everyone can help. There are plenty of capable adults in this house." No one spoke. It was not an angry silence. It was the silence of people hearing an unfamiliar answer from someone they believed completely predictable. Brittany blinked twice before forcing another smile. "I only thought it made sense since you were staying here today. And I thought it made sense that a family vacation included everyone sharing responsibility," I replied gently. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom," Brittany was only trying to organize things. I met his eyes for a long moment. "Organization is useful," I said. "Assigning one person to serve everyone else is something entirely different." My voice never rose. It did not need to. The truth often arrives more quietly than people expect. Lily looked back and forth between us before quietly taking her grandmother's hand. "Grandma," she whispered, "I can help set the table." I smiled warmly. "Thank you, sweetheart. We can all do it together." Without another word, I carried a stack of dinner plates toward the dining room. A surprising thing happened next. Daniel followed me and picked up the silverware. One cousin brought glasses. Another arranged the napkins. Even Lily carefully placed small bowls around the table. Only Brittany remained standing in the kitchen for several seconds, watching as everyone naturally divided the work she had expected one person to complete alone. During dinner, the conversation felt different. It was quieter, more thoughtful. No one mentioned the checklist again. Instead, stories about past Thanksgivings slowly returned. Daniel laughed as he remembered falling into the lake while trying to launch a canoe with his father many years earlier. Lily asked questions about Grandpa Thomas, eager to hear stories she had never known. For the first time since arriving at the lake house, I felt that the evening resembled the family gatherings my husband had always hoped we would protect. Yet beneath the peaceful conversation, I carried the quiet certainty that an even more important conversation still waited ahead. The papers I had signed that afternoon remained safely tucked inside my handbag upstairs, and before this holiday weekend came to an end, everyone would learn that respect could never be built upon silent expectation alone. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in a quiet mist that floated gently across the lake. The holiday was coming to an end, and for the first time in years I did not feel exhausted. I stood alone on the dock with a warm mug of coffee, watching the sunlight slowly dissolve the fog. Thomas used to tell me that every lake eventually reflects exactly what stands before it. Looking across the still water, I realized the same was true of families. Respect reflected respect. Kindness reflected kindness. Silence, however, often reflected whatever people believed they could get away with. Inside the house, everyone was beginning to pack for the drive home. Suitcases rolled across the hardwood floors, doors opened and closed, and conversations drifted from room to room. Brittany walked into the kitchen carrying her travel mug and glanced toward the refrigerator, where her handwritten checklist still rested beneath a small magnet shaped like a maple leaf. She removed it without saying anything and folded it into her purse. Perhaps she finally understood that some things could not simply be organized into obedience. After breakfast, Daniel asked whether we could speak privately before leaving. We stepped onto the porch overlooking the lake, the same place where he had once sat beside his father as a boy skipping stones across the water. He looked older than I remembered only a few days earlier. "Mom," he began quietly, "I have been thinking about everything that happened this weekend." I waited patiently. "I should have said something at dinner," he admitted. "I saw how uncomfortable that card made you, and I convinced myself it was easier to stay quiet than to create an argument." I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes the hardest words are also the most important ones," I said. "Silence protects the wrong person more often than we realize." He lowered his eyes. "I am sorry." There was no dramatic speech, no perfect apology capable of erasing years of small disappointments. There was only an honest sentence spoken by a man finally beginning to recognize what he had overlooked. For me, that mattered more than anger ever could. Before everyone loaded the last suitcase into the vehicles, I gathered the family together in the living room. The fireplace had burned low, filling the room with gentle warmth. I reached into my handbag and removed Thomas's letter. "Your father left me something several years ago," I said to Daniel. "It reminded me that a home is never measured by its size or its value. It is measured by whether the people inside it treat one another with dignity." I did not read every word aloud. Some memories belong only to the hearts that receive them. Instead, I folded the letter again and continued. "I also want everyone to understand something clearly. While I am alive, I will continue deciding how this house is used. That responsibility was entrusted to me, and I intend to honor it exactly as Thomas wished." The room remained completely still. Brittany looked surprised, but said nothing. Daniel gave a slow nod. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged the decision. There was nothing to debate because it had never been about ownership alone. It had always been about respect. As the cars disappeared down the long driveway one by one, Lily rolled down her window and waved enthusiastically. "Love you, Grandma," she called. "I love you too, sweetheart," I answered with a smile that reached deeper than it had in many years. After the last vehicle disappeared beyond the trees, I remained standing on the porch for a while, listening to the quiet return to the lake. The house no longer felt like a place where I was expected to earn my welcome. It felt like home again. I walked inside, opened every curtain to let the afternoon sunlight fill the rooms, and placed Thomas's letter back into the small wooden box where I kept the memories that mattered most. That Thanksgiving did not end with revenge, raised voices, or broken relationships. It ended with something far more lasting. I finally understood that protecting my own dignity did not diminish my love for my family. It simply reminded everyone, including me, that the strongest table is not the one with the finest meal upon it. It is the one where every person seated there is treated with equal respect.